Welcome to Oxford Analytica's video briefing. I'm Senior Middle East Analyst Alison Baily, and I'm joined today by our Middle East Region Head, Dr. Robin Ostle, to discuss the state of Arab democracy. Robin, we've seen a flurry of elections in the Middle East over the past few weeks, from Algeria to Iraq to Egypt. Which of these do you think are really the most important in terms of the region's post-uprising transition?
Well, if you mean transition to, as it were, democratic systems, I think I'd suggest that in the immediate to short term, none of them. Let me just explain that. If we look at Egypt and Algeria, what's happened there is that the people, in a sense, they've agreed to pay, as it were, to pay the price of lack of genuine political pluralism, freedom of expression, for the sake of stability. That's what really I think has gone on both in Egypt and in Algeria. These elections also, along with others, such as the one we've just seen yesterday in Syria, the one that took place recently in Iraq, they've, I think, reinforced the role of the armed forces in these countries. Obviously so in the case of Egypt, less obviously so in the case of Algeria, but the military and the security services are very much there in the background. Of course, in Syria, the Assad regime depends on their forces with military help from both Russia, Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. In Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister designate, wouldn't really, I think, be in such a position of power without his extremely close links with both the military and the security services. So in all these countries we're seeing the armed forces and their leaders, the generals, coming very much to the fore.
So democracy seems to be struggling to take root in quite a lot of Arab countries. What are the underlying causes of this?
I think the single most important cause is either institutions of civil society that have been degraded over decades of dictatorships, or institutions of civil society that barely exist. It's instructive to look at the example of Tunisia here, which has not had an election recently, but which will have elections, both presidential and parliamentary, probably by the end of this year. And there in that country, powerful institutions of civil society, such as the UGTT, which is the National Trades Union Movement, such as the National Association of Lawyers, the Employers Federation, and the Association of Human Rights in that country, they have in many ways held the political process together. They've controlled, to a very large extent, extremism, and it is to their credit that although the country is still in a fragile state, nevertheless it's still on the path that was, as it were, mapped out once the revolution happened in 2010, 2011. You can contrast that with Libya, for example, where for many, many decades there have not been such civil society institutions, and therefore in a situation where you have, as it were, these embryonic initiatives towards democracy seeking to take place, it's very difficult for them to counteract traditional regional and tribal loyalties. So Libya is in a very fragile state indeed as it approaches, apparently, its elections in 2 or 3 weeks' time.
So what seems to be the way forward now for these countries that lack the sort of the foundations needed for a proper democratic culture? Are we looking at more instability, or are we looking at the re-emergence of authoritarian systems once more?
Well, I think once again it varies from place to place. Just mentioning briefly Syria, this sham of an election, you can't really have an election in a situation of civil war, but that Assad has used that to bolster his own position. Nevertheless, I think both sides realise that a military solution isn't really possible, and so ultimately they're going to have to restart in some form or other a type of negotiation which will inevitably have to include the regime. I fear that in Iraq, where one of the main features that have undermined effective democratic government is sectarianism within Iraqi society, and probably that's not going to end anytime soon. When it comes to Libya, I think there's a big question as to whether the Libyan situation is going to be able to resist the attempts of General Haftar and his supporters to, as it were, take on head-on the Islamists who have gained power so far within that country. I think Libya is in a very fragile situation there. When it comes to Algeria and Egypt, I think there are some interesting possibilities for the future. Because in Egypt, for example, although and in Algeria, although both of these populations have said, yes, we want stability, it's not going to be, I think, stability at any price for the foreseeable future. I mean, if we think of Egypt, for example, although, for the short to medium term, yes, stability is necessary to try and get the economy kick-started again and so forth, so that people can get back into the habit of going regularly to work, etc. This is not going to be stability at any price for some time to come. I think that the forces that were unleashed in the revolution that overthrew the Mubarak regime will reappear if President Sisi and those around him don't start to, as it were, allow space for political pluralism and greater freedom of expression than exists at the moment. Similarly, Algeria, I think, is in a phase of transition. There are a lot of pent-up frustrations, demands on the part of that population, and I think that it's most unlikely that the ailing President Bouteflika will complete this yet fourth mandate on which he has just embarked. And there again, I think that if there isn't an opening up of political space and initiatives taken to satisfy the long-standing demands of the population in terms of unemployment, proper public services, whether in health or education, then instability will surface. So we could be looking at what may seem to be springs for these new Arab generals and armed forces, but I think there may well be springs of fairly short duration.
Robin, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on this week's Oxford Analytica video briefing. If you'd like to know more about our analysis and our advisory services, then please do check out our website. Thank you and goodbye.